about shifting paradigms.
And there's a tension.
Yes,
to it also.
there's a tension between, so that both the shift and the tension.
Yeah, I mean, there's do you want to? The whole arc of the story of autism is full of tensions and arguments. We refer to it on our cover as the most controversial diagnosis of the time, but it's been the most controversial diagnosis of the time almost since it was first coined. And we think. Did you miss everything that I just said?
No.
I'm going to just start over. Thank you. Thanks for that gesture. When we started writing the book, we made a very naive assumption, and that assumption was that when people in different places used the word autism, they were talking about the same thing. They meant the same thing, and that when people across different time periods were talking about the word autism, they were talking about the same thing. Autism turns out to be a very, very fuzzy, slippery, changing concept from one place to place and one time to another. We're all here using the word autism. But Karen and I came away from writing the book concluding that it may be a mistake to bring into one tent, under one label, everybody who we nowadays bring under the label of autism. And the reason for that is the definition of autism is very, very subjectively arrived at. By very subjectively, I mean, I think probably the people here who do evaluations might take some issue with that. But my point is that for most of its history, and I know that John, we've been on some panels, John says that this may be changing, but for most of our history, autism was not a condition that you could identify through a blood test or a cheek swab. Autism was arrived at, a diagnosis was arrived at by an individual observing another person's behaviors and making a judgment about those behaviors. And making a judgment about those behaviors against a checklist of symptoms that were considered to add up to autism. But that checklist has changed again and again and again. And decisions are made by psychiatric professionals in offices about what actually constitutes autism. I think maybe some people in the room have heard of Asperger's syndrome, and they know that that was in the book. And then in 2013, Asperger's syndrome was wiped out of the book.
So if you have Asperger's, you no longer have a label to attach yourself to if that makes your life work. Except that you haven't changed at all.
So there's an example of how quickly the diagnosis can change and how many times what we learned is that what they were talking about as autism in the 50s is not what they were talking about in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. The idea of a spectrum is a very new concept that only came into focus in the 1990s. And it's our view that the conversation about whether you want to cure autism or not trips up over this idea of, well, what are we talking about? Cure what exactly? And it depends. We think that the answer to that question is very subjective. It depends on the individual. It may depend on their families and their parents. And so my mother-in-law, who lives in Israel my wife was raised in Israel, her brother lives in Israel. He's about 50 years old now. My mother-in-law is in her 70s. She was a musician who gave up her career as a musician to keep her son out of an institution, which was what was recommended when he was diagnosed in the early 70s. And she went and looked at the institution that was recommended, and it was a snake pit. She said, I'm never going to let that happen. And so she set out to start building schools for children with autism. She did in autism what a lot of families have done here. She changed the world. She's built residential communities, etc. And she's now retired from that. And her son is a happy man who cannot speak and cannot be left alone unsupervised and needs help going to the bathroom and eating and things like that in his 50s. That's autism. That's very, very different from somebody who is perhaps a college lecturer and a brilliant mathematician who drives his car and has children and a marriage and nevertheless also is said to have autism. Now that person is unquestionably has challenges as well that explain why the autism diagnosis is there, social challenges primarily. But the question is, are those two things the same? Now, if you say to that professor, would you want to change who you are? Well, especially if he thinks his mathematical talent comes from his autism, he's going to say, absolutely not. If you say to my mother-in-law, would you have liked your son to not have had that thing that means he needs somebody to help wipe his bottom for him in his 50s? Would you have liked to have that cured? Her answer is going to be yes. I would like to have not had that happen. And it's our feeling, the tension that comes into this conversation, it's a very tense conversation the autism world comes from the fact that we may not be talking about the same thing. These two manifestations, maybe they have some common roots, but the end results are so different from each other. The outcomes are so different from each other. The responses that are needed are so different from each other.
And what society needs to do about it. For adults who can be independent, we as a community have to embrace them and let them be employed and support them, and also be willing to move 10 steps forward so that we can make it work. And that's a very, very different community of people than John's talking about in terms of his brother-in-law.